Hello. In the Crown of Aragon 639 years ago, it was January 2nd, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico, and this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Multcara Companiona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. Let's begin today's document. So, I have decided not to play the usual intro music for today's episode because the topic that we're going to be looking at is a pretty serious one. Today's document touches on sexual assault. All right, at this point, I'm going to proceed on to discuss the document. All right, so today's document is a sobering one, not about a topic that is pleasant at all. So, when I first read Violant's document from the very first episode of the podcast, I didn't see anything in there to indicate how serious the trouble was that the students in Montpellier had gotten into. It's referred to very vaguely as a case. And in hindsight, I can identify how my own position as a man, as a gay man, has really influenced my set of possibilities for what that crime could be. I, in my mind, went to, they got into like a drunken brawl or something like that. But today's document, which I had not really worked on until now, reveals that the crime was actually a sexual assault, and the perpetrators were multiple students. So it is very serious now. And what I want to convey about this is that, first of all, I didn't know. So if you go back and listen to episode 1, that is all in my own ignorance of what this situation was. I had looked ahead and found that Joan had written to the Duc de Berry and had written about Montpellier. So I knew that it was about the case, but I hadn't really worked on understanding what the document was saying. I jumped ahead and looked at the date and saw that it would fit in as being the document for January 2nd. So, frankly, I'm pretty embarrassed that I treated this with levity in the earlier episode, and I'm keeping it as is. I'm not re-recording or anything like that because I think it's a really good demonstration of how, as a historian is working through what they see in the archive, they're bringing their own blind spots to it. They're bringing their own position to it. I know historians who would have thought that sexual assault was a likely possibility when they're presented with the scenario of a group of young men being accused of a serious crime. And the fact that it wasn't in my mind as within the set of possibilities, it says a lot about what I bring to the table. And so this experience has been a really good corrective for me as I'm trying to think about all of the commonly silenced things that are in the archive. So today's document is one in which we see Joan, who is the Duke of Girona, writing to the Duc de Berry. The Duc de Berry, at this time, is the most powerful person in France. And that's because the current king of France, Charles VI, is still too young to rule. So this is a regency period. The Duc de Berry is in charge of France as Charles VI comes of age. And so now we've got Joan writing to the most politically powerful person in France about the situation with these students in Montpellier. One quick thing about the relationship between Joan and Violant and the Duc de Berry. The Duc de Berry is Violant's uncle. And so Joan and Violant correspond with him a whole lot, and I've seen a lot in the secondary literature regarding their correspondence on cultural topics. So they're asking to borrow a particular book or talking about some kind of musical style or particular troubadours maybe. But this is the first time I've seen a document in which it's not on a cultural topic and is instead about something in the realm of the criminal justice area of rule. So in the first couple lines of the document today, Joan explains the situation. He gets to it pretty quickly. And he, in the second line, identifies a woman of a good background, una doña de stament, and that means that this particular woman is not in any way suspect, and that's important for the men involved here, because again, we're operating in a very patriarchal context where the question arises of whether the woman can be believed in the situation, and her reputation plays into that. Joan then talks about how this woman at night goes from her house to the house of her brother because her brother is ill. And on one of these nights, she was, the verb is encontrada. She was encountered by certain, and then this phrase is one that I didn't understand, and once I figured it out, it really confirmed what was going on here. So she's confronted by what is written in this letter, certs velets o massips. And that phrase is one that I did not recognize, and I had to go back and forth a little bit with a couple different resources in order to figure out what it meant. And one of those resources was ChatGPT, so you can see the transcript. I've added the transcript into the webpage for today's document. But what was just as important, though, was a very low-tech resource, which was a glossary that I had found in the back of a book titled Medieval Catalan Linguistic Texts. And I wouldn't have found that if I didn't physically go to the library at the University of New Mexico and look on the shelf at their Catalan language and literature section and just kind of flip through some things. It was being there physically that I realized that this book had a very ample glossary of medieval Catalan terms and the translation into English. And so I had access to that resource. And by the way, the glossary is not mentioned in the online catalog record. So I had to be physically present in the library in order to discover this. And the entries in this glossary under the V and the M sections revealed to me that these terms were likely terms used for groups of young men. And my feeling is that the terms used here have a kind of negative connotation, something like how we would say hooligan, maybe. I'm not sure, but that's just my guess. So already in the first 3 lines, we have the necessary information. There was a woman at night, and there was a group of young men. And so clearly what happened here was sexual assault. And if it were anything else, it would not have risen to the occasion where the students are in such gigantic trouble. So there's no reason to think, oh, just a simple robbery or like a little argument. No. This is almost certainly a rape, and it's, in my mind, a brutal one. So what's going on in this letter is something that in our time, in early 2026, and what we've been hearing about in the news all throughout the second half of 2025 is the Epstein files. We can understand what's going on here. Powerful men are protecting their own. And Joan and Violant too was brought in to fulfill that mission. Someone in this group of students from Catalonia is placed high up in the bureaucracy of the state. Someone who has the title dispensaire, which is in some way related to the treasury. I'm still figuring out what that exactly is. And so Joan and Violant have written, I'm sorry, I don't know for sure if Joan wrote to Montpellier, actually. Violant has written to the officials of Montpellier to try to influence them to treat the perpetrators gently. And now Joan has written to the most politically powerful person in France so that he will use his influence to ensure that this group of rapists are treated with as little consequence as possible in the situation. When talking about contextualization, a historian has to be very careful about making direct comparisons between what goes on in the present time and what went on in the distant past. We're talking today about an event that happened over 600 years ago. And when I make a comparison about how powerful men, protect perpetrators of sexual assault, well, immediately you have to kind of press on the brake a little bit and say, well, gosh, 600 years of difference, that's got to raise some concerns about making that comparison. And indeed, there are concerns. But something to recognize is that patriarchy has been very ingrained in Western civilization. And there's a tremendous amount of continuity, even over the centuries. There's a few historians who have done some excellent work on this. For the Middle Ages in particular, I can recommend Carissa M. Harris's book, Obscene Pedagogies. It's about rape culture in medieval England. And then I can also recommend a slightly older book by Sharon Block, Rape and Sexual Power in Early America. And that book, while not about medieval Europe, is an excellent resource for understanding the historical continuities and also the historical changes, the differences regarding non-consensual sex between our time and the times and societies of past eras. So it's a very difficult topic to make proclamations about, because it's dangerous to say, oh, there's always been patriarchy. It almost makes it kind of a naturalized condition. But it's also, I think, dangerous to put up some kind of barrier between ourselves and people of the past and say, oh, what they were doing is different from what we're doing, and what they condoned is different from what we condoned. Because that, I think, will create an illusion that somehow we're doing better, when really I don't really think we are all that much. When it comes to the upper echelons of society, the most powerful people and how they behave, I think there's a lot of big differences today in how we think about the subjectivity of the victim of a sexual assault. And indeed, I can point to something that is in this letter that is in no way exculpating Joan's role in this. But he does indicate that the woman has not done anything wrong. And that is actually better than some of the rhetoric that's out there in our time about victims of sexual assault. I think Joan knows that this group of students is a group of perpetrators that they deserve to be punished. I think at the same time, he's activating this behavior that is kind of the first instinct of the powerful to protect their own. So today's document was a heavy one, and I didn't expect to encounter this subject, and I am glad that it did come up, because it reveals so much about what typically gets silenced in the archive, and indeed what was silenced in the letter that Violant wrote. I have so much more to say about all this, and there's a lot that I've added to the webpage for this particular document. That brings this episode to a close. And I will say that for this particular episode, it's not one that I feel very jovial about, so I'm not going to play the upbeat music at the end. And what we'll do is close out this episode just with the end of my voice, and we'll pick up again tomorrow and continue with the next document in the next day of the first year of the reign of Joan and Violant. In the meantime, take care.